My context, I grew up in Murahiku, Aotearoa, which is south of the South Island, to Irish settler migrant parents with family originating in County Kerry and County Clare. I migrated to Melbourne and now live on Bulekibek, Naarm, traditional lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nations. My presentation might be a bit different in that it is about air conditioning, but I'm not really going to speak that much about the air conditioning. And it's just an overview, and air conditioning is the connection, I guess, to an extractive resource and energy. But this is just an overview, more of my methodology at this current stage. And also initially asked me just to give an overview or about how those different practices or studies I've done collide. So I did an undergraduate in archaeology, social anthropology. And in my last year of that degree, I took a Māori unit in management of the environment. And then I decided to quit the archaeology and anthropology. I then went to art school. And later, after moving to Australia, I did a master's in the devaluation of art. I did some collaborations with Tyson Campbell on art and data and systems and structures of power and relationality. And then finally looked into a PhD in fine art initially, but ended up in design, ethnography, practice-based research at MADA in the Emerging Tech Lab under the supervision of Sarah Pink and Chris Cottrell. So that's how I ended up here. The research topic is situated across the fields of art and design practice and ethnography, and it questions the relationship of dressing for the air-conditioned workplace in terms of gender and labour. It might be labelled as design anthropology, where an iterative blended practice approach is used, comprising theory, ethnography, and design practice. And following in Sarah Ahmed's footsteps, the topic is an inquiry into asking who a space is designed for. I look at how the climate-controlled workplace, built environment, and dress code of the workplace become a form of power and control of people's bodies. Writing, making experimental wearables, photographs, and film are some of the components of this project. And in terms of the context of air conditioning, just some basic stats that this is a projection for 2050, where climate control accounts for 10% of global electricity, which of course requires gas or other forms to fuel it. So it's expected to be the second largest source of global electricity demand growth by 2050 after the industry sector. Currently, 70% of that is used in the domestic environment and 30% is for the commercial. So Sara Ahmed suggests that spaces and objects are designed with an orientation that has a specific end user in mind, a specific body that can use the thing or fit with the space. This orientation is never neutral, although it is often invisible and it does affect people. And Shanti Sumatoyo and Sarah Pink suggest in reference to atmospheres that understanding these political dimensions, such as orientations and how bodies move through space, may help us think about new ways of doing things. Gasson Haj's work has also been important in the framing of this study. And in Alter Politics, Haj suggests there is little to be gained from simply replacing one system for another so-called better one. It changes the politics, but it continues to repeat and maintain a dominant status quo versus a marginalised sector of society. So instead, Haj suggests systems sitting alongside each other. Acceptance as well as embracing conflict and difference is a part of this. So the rationale of the methods, it's a qualitative study employing sensory ethnography, specifically wardrobe ethnographies, clothing diaries, and cultural probes in the form of experimental wearables. And these methods are used to understand participants' daily practices of dressing for the air-conditioned workplace. Pink, Mackley, and Morizano suggest an atmosphere is forever changing, and choosing to use a fluid method based on feelings of rightness corresponds with the fluid and changeable nature of the atmosphere. Following Timothy Ingold, who argues that atmosphere is made and remade as relationships constantly remake the world, The authors give precedence to relationships that form between people and materials, and these are at the crux of how an atmosphere emerges. So the first method that I've used is a wardrobe ethnography, and Sophie Woodward reflects on her wardrobe ethnographies as sites of knowledges created in the moment between researcher and participant. Because of the relational nature of this knowledge, the researcher must be aware that their approach and role impacts what knowledge is formed as much as what the participant contributes. Being aware of this means being aware that there is no knowledge ever out there to be found. Knowledge is only the production of moments formed in relational contexts between researcher, participant, space, and object. The second method is to use cultural probes within the ethnography. And cultural probes are specifically intended to bring uncertainty into the ethnographic process, to avoid analysis and generalization, and to emphasize the subjective nature of interpretation. These are used in the second phase of the ethnographies in the form of experimental wearables. And experimental wearables are best described here as an imaginative rather than realistic use of clothing. They're designed in response, or my ones are designed in response to how the politics of the air-conditioned workplace control or don't control the body and wearing, understood through discussion with participants and their daily practices of dressing for the air-conditioned workplace. The process is one of making, listening, and remaking. Situating practices in overlapping fields is an opportunity to challenge more traditional practices that dominate a field, and therefore positioning this work across design and ethnography is an opportunity to challenge a traditional view of how ethnographies are done and how they are presented. And this example here is just from Lucy McRae and Bart Hess, and they weren't necessarily designed as propositional wearables, but their dressing, clothing, bodily adornments evoke a feeling or response, and they demonstrate how ideas can be simulated through using low-tech materials combined with thoughtful and evocative photography. I'm just going to skip over these, but these are some other examples of people working with dressing or clothing and other practices, projects with air conditioning. So where the dressing can be actual change rather than critique, there is the project Kulin. It was a campaign instigated in 2005, which sees office thermostats set no lower than 28 degrees in the summer, and a relaxed dress code or no jacket, no tie policy is encouraged. Fashion manufacturers have responded by producing a Kulin line each summer, and it's received a lot of wide consumer uptake. Elizabeth Shope suggests that tapping into consumer fashion has helped make it successful, but also potentially uses fun fashion to place responsibility on the individual and direct it away from deeper structural change. And so this leads also to another question, whether focusing on dressing is simply superficial. But Otto von Busch argues that fashion has the well-known power to be a cause of violence through microaggressions and bullying. And this power is often concealed under a rhetoric that fashion is superficial. So therefore, if it can cause that kind of violence, it can't be that superficial. I take the approach that focusing on dress and everyday practices has the potential to disrupt what is taken for granted as purely functional, practical, and professional, and consider what invisible power dynamics exist and might be revealed. Another question to ask is the topic of futures. And the works I'm doing with their lack of functionality incite critical or speculative design, where the focus is on bringing visibility to an issue. Speculative design in particular is tied up with imagining futures, and these are problematic positions to occupy. For some, it is little more than privileged academic fantasies that avoid any real change. For the Global Futures Lab, the issue is these Western futures often have a tendency to stereotype the future based on the look of Hollywood films. Think Space Odyssey onwards. But the Global Futures Lab is also a speculative design lab that works differently by working with communities and what is important as a future to that local community. So in terms of where my study sits, what it isn't is wearable tech, and what it is an experimental and sensory exploration. At this point, I'm using the term speculative interventions, which is a term drawn from design anthropology. Speculative interventions differ from speculative design in that they draw on design techniques for the making and anthropological concerns for the description and interpretation. The interventions draw on practices of design to aid an inquiry. The intention is not necessarily to produce a design work as the outcome. In other words, design may be used in the process, but a design outcome isn't necessary. And whether this term or position is any better or any different, I'm not yet sure. The first site that I did my the first ethnography was the Philip Law Building, which is named after Philip Law, an Antarctic explorer. It was done over Zoom during one of Melbourne's lockdowns, and the process requires going into a participant's intimate spaces because most people's wardrobes are in their bedrooms, and this obviously requires a lot of trust. I was lucky in that my site is the site of the Emerging Tech Lab, which is the lab I'm studying, and that made building the connections easy. As people familiar with the awkward process of ethnography, they were willing to participate. But these are the details, such as who participants are and how the relationship is developed, that heavily influence how an ethnography transpires. I'm just going to skip that one. Making the experimental wearables as cultural probes, the materials were inspired by the architecture and namesake of Building B, Philip Law, who was an Antarctic explorer who helped in mapping 400 miles of coastline and 800,000 square miles of territory for both commercial and scientific interests. And these ideas are woven into the garments. Mark Wigley makes reference to Gottfried Semper on the role of textiles in the production of interior space, not as a way to divide space, but at the core of the actual emergence of space. In this study, textiles or clothing is worn to the air-conditioned workplace and forms a dialogue between the body and the space it inhabits. Ingold's concept of weaving is appropriate as one of merging fluidity and making visible what is invisible, or vice versa. For example, the clothing we wear becomes merged with the body's furniture, architecture, patterns of air movement, spaces, presences, and absences within the environment. And it's an iterative process. So the first iterations, the wearables respond to the theoretical research. They're then developed and changed further after the wardrobe tours and discussions with participants. And this openness then lends insights that I wouldn't have ever thought of myself. For example, the sock, which is often concealed. And it turned out so far to be one of the items most participants had strong opinions on, from the sock's ability to evoke memory and mood to the physical and psychological comfort the right or wrong sock could provide. And that's it. Thank you.